I am thrilled to introduce the lifelong explorer, evolutionary biologist, and two-time Pulitzer Prize winner, Professor Edward O. Wilson.
Okay, I'm certainly very grateful. I feel honored to be invited to give this lecture at this World Science Festival, and I'm grateful to you for joining me here. Now, in Paul Gauguin's 1898 masterpiece, he never painted me. Here we are. Tahitian masterpiece, which he intended to be his last work before committing suicide. He didn't. He went on up with arsenic he'd piled up sufficient lethal dose to take with him, and went to the mountains in order to hide himself so that he would be eaten by ants, he said, before he was found, but he didn't. He came back and went on painting, but not by very much. And then looking for more solitude, he went out to the farthest corner of the world, the Marquesas, where he did, in fact, not commit suicide, but he did die. But he gave a title in this in the left-hand corner, as you see it, these famous questions: where do we come from? What are we, and where are we going? Now, these happen to be the three central questions of religion and philosophy. Through millennia, we've thought and argued about the first of these two questions: where do we come from, and what are we? Will we ever be able to solve them? Sometimes it seems not yet. Maybe we can. Religion will never provide the answers. The reason is that each organized religion, and there are hundreds of them, has its own different creation story in competition with all the others. Each creation story was written in times when the authors knew almost nothing about the universe, the planet, life on Earth, or the prehistory of the human condition. Each considers its creation story an answer to where do we come from, and what are we, and where are we going, to be set in stone and superior to all the others. Each was born from the dreams and speculations of shamans and prophets. They can't all be correct. No two can be correct. In fact, none is consistent with our growing knowledge of the universe, the planet, life on Earth, and the prehistory of the human condition. We also look in vain to philosophy for the answer to the great riddle. Passe, my colleagues in philosophy, despite its noble purpose, despite its effectiveness in training the mind to inquire and think logically, professional secular philosophy long ago gave up trying to answer the overall question: what is the meaning of life? Most of the history of philosophy is strewn with the wreckage of theories of the conscious mind. After the decline of logical positivism in the middle of the last century and the attempt to join science and logic into a closed system, philosophers have scattered in an intellectual diaspora into those areas not yet colonized by science, into intellectual history, semantics, logic, foundational mathematics, ethics, and most profitably, problems of personal life adjustment. By default, then, the solution of the great riddle has been left to science, to knowledge of the real world that can be tested and shared with every person. What science's promises and has already supplied in part is the following: there is a real creation story of humanity, and one only. And it isn't a myth. It's being worked out and tested and enriched and strengthened step by step. What I'll attempt to show you today is to tell you that story, as I believe it's coming into focus. It comes together from multiple disciplines, from molecular genetics to neuroscience evolutionary biology to ecology, archaeology, paleoanthropology, social psychology, and history. To make that effort, let me first define the very high level of social complexity we call eusociality, EU, meaning, well, originally agreeable or peaceful, but we mean really that, really social, highly social. It is the existence of groups over multiple generations in which adult members rear the young cooperatively and vary their own longevity or reproduction or both in ways that enhances the complexity of social organization. There are countless thousands of animal species that form social groups, and some are dramatic, like the gorilla troop here, especially the chimpanzee, but almost all, like gorillas and chimpanzees, fall short of eusociality. They lack a consistent division of reproduction and labor. In fact, true sociality has originated on the terrestrial part of the planet only very rarely. And here I'm going to bring in, I believe for the first time into these discussions, comparative zoology, which I feel is critical to the solution of the problem of the origin of the human condition. It's come into existence, to the best of my knowledge, eusociality has been, about 24 times of which we have record, variously in several kinds of insects, twice in the mole rats of Africa, once in the human line. It didn't happen at all until quite late in evolutionary time, from the early Mesozoic. That's how far back the first cases we know of. It goes about 150 million years ago. And finally, and strikingly, it is in this very small array of evolutionary lines that the numerically most abundant and ecologically dominant creatures on Earth are found. Advanced social animals rule the land. In many habitats of the world, for example, rainforests and African savanna, ants. I've just come back 3 days ago from the African savanna. If I say something that sounds dopey, you will, of course, forgive me from jet lag. But at any rate, we find that the ants alone outweigh all of the land vertebrates together 4 times. For example, in the Mozambique savanna where I was working, ants and termites together weigh approximately 100 kilograms per hectare. And that's more, considerably more, than all of the mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians combined. This is the setting we need to address in order to understand the origin of humanity. And here are the more basic questions, more than even what it all means and how it originated in humans, that biologists and anthropologists have not yet addressed. First question, why does advanced social life exist at all, and why has it occurred so rarely? Why, given that the conditions is so enormously successful, for example, or to wit, the eusocial insects, ants, bees, wasps, termites, comprise only about 2 to 3% of all of the known species of insects on Earth. Yet, in most habitats, they weigh more than 50%, they have more than 50% of all of the insect biomass. And the second question, what is the driving force in evolution that brought eusociality, this quite rare condition, into existence? The first great evolutionary wave of insects was 400 million years to 250 million years ago and came to a crashing end, like so much of the diversity of life, with the end of the Permian period. During this time of 150 million years, there was an exuberant evolution among insects. Some of the presently existing orders of insects, like beetles and mayflies and cockroaches, first originated there. But then also a great diversity of other kinds of insects with names like Eumycoptera, Paleodictyoptera, Orthoptera, and so on, names that you will have already promptly forgotten had you been listening, became extinct. And out of that great diversity, which one insect paleontologist has very nicely puzzled out as occupying different niches on the coal forest trees, out of that vast array, rivaling what was to follow in our own time, no sign of eusociality occurred in the insects or other invertebrates. It simply hadn't happened yet. The first ants and termites appeared around 150 million years ago, early Jurassic. But in the Mesozoic, there was still no eusocial vertebrate, in spite of anatomically likely candidates. There were reptiles of great variety and even early mammals, but of eusociality, nothing. And to illustrate what the potential was, I've now used the example of one of the bipedal dinosaurs with hands and the brain. Actually, we don't know what the capacity of a reptile brain would be in the course of evolution, but surely enough for the kind of advanced part way that actually brought us into existence over the last 2 million years. So I've used the diagram made by another paleontologist of the dinosauroid of what it might have looked like had this occasion happened, but it didn't. Now, to explain what happened, or better, almost didn't happen, let me offer the metaphor of the evolutionary maze. Species proceed through the maze step by step. All species do. It's inevitable. Led by the action of natural selection, generation by generation, on the genomes they possess in each instant of time. They can move in one direction or another, as metaphorized in this maze. They can stall for a while. They can even regress. It is a matter of luck, enabled by mutation, driven by natural selection to reach any point in that maze. And that is achieved by a series of particular steps, each of which may or may not take place. If we look retrospectively at the result in which we are interested, in this case, eusociality, from, say, solitary hymenopteran ancestors, the upper left-hand corner, through all the steps in that maze, finally, to come out with a eusocial species, an ant. Then we can speak of these essentially random pre-adaptations. And there is a final step, lower right-hand corner, whatever it is, from solitary or elementary group to eusociality. What is that final step? It is, in all of the 24 cases of which I have found record and have been able to study, it is, in all of them, the rearing of young in a valuable constructed nest, defended, from which individuals forage for food, return with it to give to the young, growing progressively until they reach maturity. That's it. Every one, no exception, of the 24 cases reach eusociality that way. So the question is, did humans? More of that in a moment. But just for example, here we have at the top a eusocial shrimp, marine shrimp. It fits that. There's a queen in the middle. They're nesting in burrows built in sponges, and those are young all around, defending the nest and going out to forage for food. On the right, halictid bees, among the most primitively eusocial insects we know. And here, burrows are built, nest chambers constructed, and there's a queen, very early stage of evolution, and workers very similar and anatomically and behaviorally otherwise to the queen go forth, forage for food, altruistically, bring it, raise brothers and sisters. Then we have vast numbers of cases, and this is what's very instructive, sort of like a evolutionarily controlled experiment, like the one of these arrowtillid beetles here, in which there are societies. In this case, it's the young being led along in a herd, carefully tended herd, by the adults. And of all these cases we know, called subsociality, not a single one in the phylogeny or even in the inferred preceding stage of true eusociality, not one has ever gone on to eusociality. The thing they lack, a defended nest from which some individuals go forth to bring food, to bring back to the young and feed them until they reach maturity. Quite a few species of animals are at the threshold. Chimpanzees and gorillas, for example, is shown here, the African wild dog, which is almost, but not quite, eusocial. And many, many subsocial insects, as I've said, which just get there, but they don't cross. But they haven't taken the final step. And they really haven't gone very, very far. They're successful, but they're just another species in the ecosystem. Now I'm going to use recent primary research literature. I've depended almost entirely on that, rather than the interpretations of others, or even, well, I have used in some cases authoritative reviews to trace the steps as best I can understand them. In other words, those propitious pre-adaptations that led from the split between the pre-human and chimpanzee lines some 6 million years ago. Now this is what I'm about to show you, and then try to identify the point at which humans became eusocial in a broad sense. It's the synthesis of a great deal of work by many gifted scientists around the world, and I wish they could all be listed, but this is not my work. There is brilliant work that has been achieved in this area and is, in fact, multiplying now. The first step was to come out of the trees and walk on the hind legs. And the chimps have done both of these, but their walk is not erect. It is knuckle walking, essentially still four-footed. They're bipedal. They use tools. They have cultures which are particular to individual localities and populations and obviously passed down from one generation to the next. Stone throwing, swimming or entering water, termite fishing, one in each population and so on. But that's it. It's very, very limited. The habitat, however, this is what's of some interest. The habitats in which pre-humans evolved was the African savanna, the biome that ranges from tree-dotted grassland to open, dry, seasonal forest. As I've said, I've just returned from doing research there and am so very impressed to actually be one of the 102 mammal species native to Mozambique that are on the checklist from the Gorongosa National Park. I like to remind people that. As we go out, we see a honeybee nest up in a baobab tree. I say, that species, Apis mellifera, that's up in that tree is native to here. And we are native. We are a native species. Now, at the time of the breakout, 60,000 years ago, approximately, people were living pretty much like the Kung San of the Kalahari is shown here. But now we have to go back to connect them with the most primitive forms of prehumans that have been tracked, that gives us a sense of the steps leading up to, if I'm not overusing the word, to the event of eusociality in humans. 4.4 million years ago, we have remains of something called Ardipithecus. It had obviously come out of the trees in part. It had long arms. Presumably it could still brachiate in the trees, but it walked on legs straight. It was straight up walking. Also, it and its immediate descendants had one great advantage, which I will call a pre-adaptation, but it's not fortuitous, it was essential. And that is the primate condition of fingers that have pulpy tips, flat nails, the capacity to create a gripping organ, and even eventually an opposable thumb. And that made all the difference in these newly erect creatures. In being, their ancestors had it, and their ancestors used it to pick fruit, vegetable material with precision, like pulling seeds out, like peeling things, so on. That was their adaptation. And that was to be a vital human trait. Within a million years, what may have been Ardipithecus, or as a direct ancestor, we don't have enough information to know how many species there were, whether that creature was on the main line, but something like it probably was close, or was the actual ancestor. Now we have the Australopithecines, and they have taken a very important step forward, based largely on their bipedalism. And we find now that the arms have shortened, that not only the legs, but the feet have elongated, giving the creature a rocking foot motion. And it's developed a basin-shaped pelvis into which the internal organs of a fully bipedal creature could rest with minimum energy expense and deficiency. There was an adaptive radiation going on. This was a pretty successful group in terms of species. The Australopithecines multiplied in species across Africa. There were, at one time at least, 3 coexisting on the African continent, primarily the East African region. And these were specialized, among them, undoubtedly for vegetable food of different types. The skull varied in massiveness or lack of it, gracile versus massive, probably having to do with dealing with different kinds of vegetables with variable toughness. From one of these species of the Australopith radiation, an evolutionary line evolved that lifted not just Australopith, not just old world primates and mammals, but all of life to an entirely new level. It occurred beginning about 3 million years ago and was manifested in the dramatic increase in brain size, particularly the memory storing regions of the cortex. Prior to this time, the pre-human brain size at 400 to 500 cubic centimeters was not much above the size of a chimp. If E.T. had arrived and made the survey of life on Earth and sent the report back and then left this interesting but unspectacular planet from all the ones they've seen. It would said, observing the Australopiths, it's an interesting primate development. But the really interesting thing on this planet is the amazing social insects. See volume 3 through 16. I admit that that's a partisan view, but I suspect that really would be the case. But now, all of that changes. The brain size increases dramatically at what was quite possibly the fastest rate for a complex organ ever. What was going on? And now we come to the sticking point, where I admit this is a guess. But what was going on, the crucial event occurred at about the time of one of these Australopith species arising or developing with a brain size that was about 640 cubic centimeters. That's Homo habilis. About, I wish we knew more. But what happened to the habilines was that they shifted from vegetarian food, like chimps, which has, I think, get 3% of their calories from hunting, killing vervets and a few prey, whereas humans get 10 times that amount over average overall hunter-gatherer societies. The habilines, they shifted to a greater consumption of meat. Now, very likely they had been feeding on small animals already, as do chimps today, I've said. But in addition, at best guessed, they shifted reliance to animals of all sizes. And they could have been animals collected after lightning-struck ground fires. When you live for a while in these savanna environments, as I have, including the southern United States, which is primarily the longleaf pine savanna, 60% of it, then you are very impressed at how rapidly ground fires occur from lightning strikes. And if it's a well-balanced, biodiverse environment that allows these lightning-struck fires that they can proceed in these frequent intervals, then you keep that environment stable. Meat, if you can get it, is energetically more efficient per gram, and cooked meat, which was available to these creatures as fire-killed, is easiest to digest, eat and digest. And that is an idea not original with me, but it has gained some currency for this stage of evolution among paleoanthropologists. What began as the runaway growth of brain size was not just the consumption of meat, however, it was the way meat is harvested. Animals that live in groups and hunt typically do so from dens, from strongholds, as in wild dogs and wolves, where some stay to protect the young, almost by necessity, while others hunt for prey and scavenge meat to bring home. And if they can bring down the prey, then they have enough calorific food, calories in food, to serve the entire group. So right about here, in other words, 3 to 2 million years ago, pre-humans created campsites. They began using, if you permit me, protected nests, where offspring could be raised progressively. In other words, they came and passed over the threshold to eusociality, just as in all other known species of animals that breach and cross the threshold, for which we can confidently reconstruct the event. And once again, let me repeat that outside of humans, every case without exception that we've tracked phylogenetically and seen, we can do this with insects because we have huge numbers of species in almost every major group. We can make inferences not possible with vertebrates. Every one went this pathway. But then, what is going on? When you live in close contact in the same place, when you no longer travel around in loose groups, searching for fruit and other vegetable food, transmitting messages back and forth that you found something or not found something, as do the chimps. When you divide labor, then the reading of intention becomes vital. Understanding from body language and facial expression and vocalizations what other people think and want, and from that, you develop cooperation based on social intelligence. Social intelligence is the key. And here I speak not for myself, I think I speak for a large number of cognitive psychologists who are beginning to see the human condition. One of the fundamental traits of the human condition, along with group conflict, is that. By the time of Homo erectus, descendants of the Havilans most likely, and direct ancestors of our own species, almost certainly Homo sapiens, campsites were well developed. Fire had been controlled at the campsites, and stone tools had been adopted. Brain size was significantly increased over that of the Havilans, halfway to the erectus level. By 60,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were fully evolved into our present form. And the breakout from Africa occurred most likely up the Nile corridor, followed by a rapid spread through population growth all the way to Australia. The physical appearance and early culture of these pioneers is preserved, at least in part, in a few places. Mabuti, Pygmies of the Congo, the Little Andamanese, Pygmies of northern Luzon, the people of New Guinea and Australia. Now to the next key question I proposed. What drove one of the several pre-human Australopithecine lines to the eusocial threshold? It was almost certainly group selection. And here I depart from a lot of colleagues to their discomfort. As William James once said, history is a bloodbath. And we know that was the case very early in human history and prehistory. What we've looked on as an extreme aggressiveness in the Yanomamo, have I got them up there yet? Yep. Wonderful people. Of northern South America and other warlike people has been true of our own societies, whether periodically or even continuously, almost uniformly. Vengeance raids were succeeded by organized, divinely sanctioned war, as so vividly and proudly shown by the Mayans and other chiefdoms and early states around the world during and following their evolution. From the best evidence we have in damaged skeletons and cave paintings, raids, battles were common all the way back into the Paleolithic. These are, there's a lot more to cave art than just beautiful animals. It's full of interesting graffiti, some of which is still not proper for mixed company, and also for scenes such as these, which show unquestionably people getting killed with spear thrust. Now let me remind you of the basic process of individual level natural selection with an imaginary shift of, say, plumage color, just to make it the elementary part clear. Before returning to group selection, there are two competing alleles in this ultra-simple experiment, different forms of the same gene. The trait prescribed by one of the alleles for dark blue results in a higher genetic fitness, meaning greater longevity, reproductive performance, or both. Over a number of generations, the dark blue allele replaces the competing light blue allele. Individual selection of genetic traits occurs when members of the same group, when we're in an early stage of group evolution, when members of the group compete with members of the same group, individual selection is occurring. Group selection occurs when groups compete with other groups on the basis of interactions of social individuals within each group. And here is what's important. This distinction, contrary to an enormous amount of confusion in the literature trying to solve these problems semantically, this distinction between individual and group selection, the two together, called multi-level selection, is open to precise genetic analysis simply by the two-part classification of the traits, that is, the phenotypes. The phenotypic targets of the group selected traits are the inherited forms of interaction among members of the same group, including communication, dominance procedures, cooperation. Now, it's rare in evolution, as I've stressed. I'm not sure what's coming next. Anyway, let me go on. Yeah, we're stopping here. I asked if we stopped here because I don't want to confuse you with another subject, which if I had time I would cover, but I'm going to leave it off as to how this translates into different aspects of human culture. At any rate, it's rare in evolution, as I've stressed, that group selection prevails over individual selection. Now, this is a phenomenon because of the rarity of the origin of eusociality, prima facie, that we need to think about. So it's not too hard to have a mutation that silences, shall we say, the dispersal tendencies of group of offspring with a pair, a mated pair, or a small group. One mutation will do that. It'll silence the dispersal. So why hasn't it gone on? Well, group selection has a tough time, apparently, prevailing over individual level selection, creating altruism in eusocial societies. It happens through the following balance, I believe, of individual selection and group selection. Within groups, and this is an overstatement, but nevertheless, it's the idea I want to convey. Within groups, selfish individuals beat altruistic individuals, but groups of altruists beat groups of selfish individuals. That is, sin, if you please, is favored by individual selection, and virtue, if you please, is favored by group selection. The conflict between individual selection and group selection is unstable in genetic evolution. That instability and the conflicted nature of the human mind is responsible for a large part of the content of the humanities. Now, before I generate too much rage among you, I will pass on quickly. Those who have followed recent literature in evolutionary theory will recognize that this account of the driving force, multi-level selection with emphasis on group selection, that's the key, is at variance with the traditional theory of the evolution of altruistic behavior and eusociality by kin selection and its supposed product, the measure of inclusive fitness. Now, I certainly embraced that when it first came out 40 years ago, but things have changed. A lot more evidence is here. So 2 years ago, including the material I've just gone through with you, 2 years ago, two mathematicians of the first rank. Now, I make that statement, that sweeping statement of the first rank, Martin Novak and Corina Tarnita, because the problem, the mathematical problem of taking the Hamilton inequality all the way down to its foundation, with all the assumptions and all the possibilities, that's a difficult mathematical problem. But this has been solved by them, and we know it's been solved. When we brought our paper ready, it was sent to Nature, and to anyone who says, but I think as a couple of commentators have said, maybe it's because the prestige of Harvard resulted in Nature publishing that paper. Let me assure you, Nature sent an editor to have a conference with us, and we went through the entire thing with the Nature editor before they submitted it to very strict peer review, I can tell you. And I know that the mathematical analysis of the Hamilton inequality performed by Novak and Tarnita is correct. I'm not a mathematician, but it has been worked through repeatedly by one mathematician who recently said, it's too beautiful not to be true. Well, we've heard that too, but that's nice. Anyway, that is, well, it showed that the basic assumptions of inclusive fitness theory are mathematically unsound. I could spell out why it's mathematically unsound. And second, and this is my contribution, that equally good or superior biological explanations for behavior previously ascribed to kin selection are available. Other explanations are available for multi-level selection entailing individual level selection alone or in interaction with group selection. Now, I've tested every case that I can find in the literature on that and found this, that I could demonstrate this, that multi-level selection is the one that's most comprehensive, most clear-cut, and in my mind, most feasible. I even was down recently with experts on one of the favorite examples, that of helper at the nest of birds, and I actually went through all of the evidence for one hypothesis as to another with the researchers working on it and with the birds in the field. I was there. At any rate, our arguments have created a lot of spirited defense of kin selection theory, but none, to my knowledge, has addressed what we pointed out in 2010 are the fatal flaws at its foundation. Now, I've covered this subject in considerable depth in my book, The Social Conquest of Earth. And if interested, you can pursue the subject there and also in Martin Novak's recent book, Super Cooperators. I'm running out of time, so I will now sum up. In any case, if we are right, and I'm confident on this issue we are right, the door is now fully open for a fuller examination than has been possible of the biological origins of our profoundly conflicted human nature. The overall perception of the origin of the human condition of this kind, I believe, throws light on subjects in the social sciences and humanities previously unconnected in this way to biological research. The origins of culture, language, morality, religion, the creative arts, of the kind, in many cases, already well underway, connections of this kind, by scholars in various fields. It also offers promise that the three great, and now I'm reaching, the three great branches of learning, the natural sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities, will be linked in a new and interesting manner. Thank you very much. Do we have time?
Take a few questions?
Yes. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm making mental note of those not applauding to recognize loyalists of kin selection. I didn't see any, but I have time. We have time for several questions, and I'd be very happy to entertain them now. Questions, comments?
Would it be logical then to say that communities impose laws on the individual as they try to survive amongst other communities?
Absolutely. Yeah, and our obedience to laws, to mores, to our rules, very conservative streak in us is inherited probably, I'm just guessing, but this is speculation, but has evolved with very good purpose, for resolution and the ability for a group to unite, particularly under stress. Yeah.
Hi. Could you talk a little bit about the break from when pre-humans went from not conscious of themselves and their environment to where they began to perceive themselves as separate from the environment?
If I could answer the question of how people have managed to create culture and a whole worldview and a way of thinking that separates them from the rest of the environment, I would publish it herewith. As a matter of fact, I have tried to do that in a series of books, including one called Biophilia. And I do have a book forthcoming Please, if there's a representative of W.W. Norton present, make note that I'm doing the job here. I hope next year, called Goran Gozan, A Window on Her Eternity, in which I present the history, the nature of Goran Gozan National Park, almost destroyed by the Civil War of 76 to 92, and which is being revived now. I'm an advisor for this in Mozambique. It was a good place to try to answer that question just asked, that what is there about humans that make us almost seem, unstoppable in our reckless destruction, actually, of the rest of life. That's what we're doing around the world. We're destroying the rest of life. But don't get me started. This is a key question that I think ought to be examined in a more distance and logical way to make it more convincing, the moral argument more convincing.
Yeah, I'm sorry, over here. I wonder if you might speculate on the situation with the small-toothed marine mammals, for example, which display almost all of the eusocial characteristics you went over, with the exception of the defense of a den, which seems somehow irrelevant in an aquatic environment, including large brain growth and so forth.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because we have only the African mole rats for the small mammals as eusocial. And it is a fact that lots of mammals have nests, and they go out and get food and bring it to the young, and birds do. Altricial birds. All altricial bird species virtually build a nest and they go out. And so why haven't we had any eusocial birds, particularly? Now, I don't want to ignore this and say, oh, that's nothing. It could be construed as negative evidence of what I've just said. But thinking back to Ardipithecus and to the fundamental primate trait, I think it has a lot to do with the fact that birds operate with beaks and claws. They just didn't have that pre-adaptation, and I'd like to say to any future authors of science fiction, alien invasion movies, that please have the aliens with pulpy fingers and not claws or fangs. You're going to have to make them that, at least to that degree, humanoid. I'd like to let Harold here have a question, because if I'm going to get a tough question, I want to get it over with now.
Not that tough, Ed.
Okay.
But all of us have been involved in scientific disputes, like to think about the experiment or the evidence that would silence our critics or silence ourselves. So when you think about what might destroy those who hold to kin selection, or when you think about how you yourself might change your mind,
yes,
what are the pieces of evidence that you think, difficult though they might be to obtain, would be decisive in these arguments?
Yeah, I think that's a fair question. And this is, after all, a science festival. I mean, science, right? Okay. I think I did touch on what destroyed in my view, the kin selection. Mathematical disproof of the function, the better explanations, alternative explanation. What would destroy this thesis I'm giving you? I think the most vulnerable area is paleoanthropology, and the details worked out in timing and ecology, which paleoanthropologists are moving rapidly to fill in. And if it doesn't fit, it seems to in the broadest terms now, but if that doesn't fit, if something is discordant there, we'll have to think again. But I think in the case of social insects, we are on very solid grounds, because we have lots and lots of studies, and total with phylogenies and total life cycle studies and so on. And the other reason that I hesitate about offering vulnerability is I hate to think about it. You understand.
I
Yes.
have a question. I'm right here. Okay, actually, I had two questions. One
Yeah.
might be a little too complicated. It was, what are we going to do with this new mathematical understanding that you're so sure of? But I think a more interesting question for this group is, where are we going to be as a human species, let's say millions of years from now, provided that our Earth is still intact?
Well, you know, I avoided the question of the third question of Mr. Gauguin, where are we going? And you are a person I know that thinks a lot about that question of where we're going, especially when that moment comes, red over coffee and scrambled eggs on the front page of the New York Times, when the first rock planet proves to have this equilibrial gas envelope, and therefore it looks as though life does exist elsewhere. And but I'm getting off the track. What are we going to do? I mean, where do I think we'll be? How long from now?
Well, you can pick a number that you can pick a number in the future that you
Oh,
thought of,
my
but I would
goodness.
say millions of years.
You know, 50
millions
years,
of years.
50 years. Because, look, science and technology is a fact. It's doubling every 10 to 20 years, depending on discipline. And that's been the case, incidentally, since the 17th century. I mean, we've just been going up and up. Now we're like that. And who can predict what we're going to find out, what new technologies will apply to, even to subjects like the one I've been talking about? It's just impossible. So I picked the last chapter in my book on where are we going, to say, admittedly biased, where we probably won't want to go. And one of them is to take our poor, frail, primate, perfect Earth-adapted bodies into space to colonize some place after we've used up this planet. To me, that's the worst idea I ever heard. So I think we're going to stay put. And so we really almost have to turn this planet into the livable home that it should be. And our bodies, after all, you know, we are adapted to this planet in every aspect of our physiology, our anatomy, our mental state. I mean, why should we want to leave? The other thing has to do with your specialty, and that is if we find ET, what are they going to be like? Are they going to be hostile? You know, I think that if what I've just laid out, promoting, turns out to be valid as a general theory, we can say this much. They're going to have pulpy flat nails, and that they are going to be conflicted as we are. Because, you know, if it's happened in 24 or so times, independently, over now it amounts to, you know, 150 million years, always the same way, in very different environments. Maybe, just thinking, you know, just guessing, maybe that's the way it always happens, regardless of all the environment. Just a thought. Yeah.
So you've been dealing with questions about time in terms of where are we going, but I'm going to ask another sort of type of question about time, which has been very interesting to me for a long time and touches upon these notions of eusociality that you've discussed. And this is basically, of the creatures that display eusociality, and also, I guess, the timeline of human evolution, at some point the notion and sensitivity to time and the understanding of the world, not just in spatial terms, but also in temporal terms, was one of the main advances of our society. And my question is, how does that play into the criteria of eusociality? And does that play a role in other of the creatures that display this?
Yeah. Well, I devoted the limited time I had here today to the genetics, you know, the genetic base and the general trend. But then it's an entirely new set of problems or questions to be discussed. In fact, they are among the classical questions of evolutionary studies, is how did culture originate? And what impact did culture have on the genetic determinants of behavior, in social behavior in humans? You know, is there instinct and so on? Unless Tracy will try to persuade the audience to stay another hour, I'm not going to enter into that. But I do say that in the book, I put a lot of time into that. And I do have chapters on what I think is the best answer that's possible for how culture originated, what it is exactly, having to do with the flexibility of phenotypes and so on, how it has evolved, co-evolved with genetic evolution, the process called gene culture coevolution, an entire field of inquiry which is still largely uninvestigated either by theory or by instructed experimental, empirical research, and so on. And then taking it into things like the origin of morality, of creative arts, and so on. This is where I'd love to at least watch as a spectator if the subject holds up. I mean, this whole approach holds up. This is a whole new domain, but it doesn't change, in my mind, the importance of the humans, the pre-humans, going through the same bottleneck to the final stage of eusociality that apparently the rest of advanced social creatures went through. One more? Yes. Uh-oh. My former student, Mark Moffat,
Hey, Ed.
who's been causing me trouble in various categories for some years.
What are you doing? What are you doing out of the rainforest, Ed?
Okay, well,
Just curious. You've always said that if you were starting your career now, you'd become a microbiologist, I think.
yes, I did say that, and I mean it.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. I don't think you're giving those little guys enough credit because, from their point of view, eusociality is everywhere. All our bodies are eusocial groups
Well,
of.
that's another important point. One of the main things that you do bring it up has to do, with why it's important to understand the relation between individual level selection and group selection, and why it's so seldom that we get group selection managing in the face of normally overpowering individual selection, applies certainly to the origin of the levels of biological organization. The origin of the eukaryotic cell to start with took a long time. The origin of multicellular organism, long time. You'd think it was sort of a logical step if you were an engineer and designing it, but when it has to be done by natural selection, with all that competition between the two levels of selection and ambiguities and so on, then maybe the slow pace of major level evolution makes more sense. Yes, thanks for asking the question. Okay, simple as that. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to Professor Wilson. Certainly he is someone who not only stands on the shoulders of giants, but hopefully everyone in this room will start standing on his shoulders. Thanks very much.